Up until this point in the series, all the maps released for Zombies had been graded on a scale that ran from beloved to just okay, just kind of forgettable. Most maps were honestly fan favorites, and the very few that weren't, like 5 for example, were generally inoffensive and weren't actively hated by the community, just ignored. That changed when the third DLC map for Black Ops 1 was released. Shangri-la was the first time that there was active animosity from the community towards a map. It wasn't like 5, where it was seen as a bonus released alongside a more mainstream alternative. This was a mainline entry that people had waited months for, so any controversies were front and center. And it definitely was controversial. Back then, just anecdotally, I know I personally spent a lot more time on Call of the Dead during Shangri-La's life cycle than I ever did on Shangri-La itself. Now, that said, looking back on it now, Shangri-La took a lot of steps in the right direction. Some of those steps might have been too far too fast, but there are a lot of really interesting things that make this map a really cool experiment, and it's worth exploring why the developers made the choices they did when making the first controversial Zombies map.
It's an eclipse! We must have... Run!
The name of the game for Shangri-La was Difficulty, coming from disrupting the conventions that players had gotten used to exploiting over time. At this point, the strategy for any given map was well known. You always grab a low-damage rapid-fire gun for points, you get a wonder weapon for emergencies, and then you train zombies up in a big open area that had access to an environmental trap nearby. At least for every map that was released so far, the game was basically solved. And this was the first real mainstream explosion of people going for high rounds, because it was achievable by pretty much everyone. It was more a measure of your patience than how difficult the game was. Shangri-La coming out when it did really felt like a direct response to that, because they took away a lot of those tools that people were using to make the game so easy. The most obvious thing to anyone who played it was the fact that there were no more open areas like Kino der Toten's stage or the lunar lander platform on Ascension. Instead, the space was closer to the design seen back in Verrückt, of tight, claustrophobic hallways where you had to constantly be moving throughout the entire map or else you'd get trapped. Not only that, it followed in the footsteps of Call of the Dead in that there were 0 traps built into the map to kill zombies for you. You had to put in all the work yourself. The hazards and features that were on the map felt a lot more targeted at you than they did at the zombies, with things like the mud maze and the punji stakes only serving to slow you down and allow the horde to catch up to you. Again, the explicit idea here was to craft a map that players couldn't just use the same old strategies on. A map that forced you to play differently and felt unique. But being forced away from the strategies that we had grown comfortable with and had grown to enjoy using felt frustrating. And because it felt so sudden with it all happening on this one specific map, it felt like a huge jump in difficulty that was unreasonable for the developers to ask. Which is why Shangri-La definitely wasn't a fan favorite at the time, but it was a band-aid that they had to rip off to continue evolving the mode and not get stuck in stagnation. That overall increase in difficulty was intentional and calculated, and I think the right idea at a high level, but there were a couple of things that they did to accomplish it that in my opinion went a little too far. The removal of big, easy training spots was an obvious one and a good way to hit that goal, but for example, take something like the mud maze for something on the other side of the spectrum. So, to progress past this area on the map, you either had to take the mud, which was even worse than the mud from Shinonuma. It would slow you down to almost a complete stop, and it was basically impassable if you had any zombies behind you. Or you took the randomly generated platforms that went in a different direction each time, and you just hoped that it took you to where you wanted to go instead of into the waiting arms of the horde that you had gathered up. Obviously, yes, it did make the game harder, but there are ways to make things more difficult without making them less fun at the same time. Either it physically made the game worse to play by messing with your movement, or it had the possibility to kill you with RNG, when the best game design is to make sure that when the player dies, it's their fault. It's because of the mistakes that they made. One more example of something that I know for a fact didn't work out as well as they had hoped was the changes to the Pack-a-Punch system. So there was this very brief period at the end of Black Ops 1's life cycle where Treyarch experimented with forcing the players to coordinate with each other if they wanted to get that power up to their weapons. Again, at a high level, this is a totally reasonable goal. It's a co-op game, so in theory, it makes sense to want to add elements that encourage teamwork and force the players to cooperate with each other. Up until now, the only actual interactions forced by the gameplay were reviving other players if they went down. Other than that, you could just split off to opposite corners of the map and just basically run your own solo game for the entire duration. The problem with this idea is, to put it nicely, randomly selected players from the Call of Duty community are, at best, stubborn. Something like this doesn't really result in magical moments of silent cooperation so much as it just makes Shangri-La effectively impossible to play online. If you're playing with a group of friends, it's very doable to get everyone to split up and stand on the different pressure plates around the map to unlock the Pack-a-Punch area. It's not a casual experience, you still have to get everyone to time it right and everything like that, but it's doable. On the other hand, playing with randoms, where half the time you're lucky to even be in a game with someone with a mic, there are just no in-game features that allow you to organize with that level of specificity. And that really killed the growth of the map because it was impossible to have a meaningful game without organizing a group to play offline. That's also not to say that everything about the map was terrible. Even though it frustrated a lot of people at the time, there were a lot of things that everyone could agree were objectively pretty great. For one, the visual environment of the map was absolutely gorgeous. The Himalayan jungle was vibrant and colorful, which was something we hadn't really seen before in this mode. The closest we'd come was Shinonuma, but even that felt a little grungy. This felt like a jungle that was still full of life. It proved that Zombies maps didn't have to be set in those dark and decrepit ruins all the time. They could be set in a variety of different settings and still maintain that level of claustrophobia and tension. Also similar to Shinonuma, the perk machines were placed randomly around the map each time you started up a new game instead of having a fixed location. This made sure that every time you played, you always had that feeling of discovery and variety, and things didn't get stale after you played the map a bunch of times. You also couldn't optimize your route to power at the start of every game because you didn't know, for example, where Juggernog would be, so you were free to kind of explore the map as you wanted instead of having a forced path every time. That feeling of exploration actually works perfectly for this map because of how well the vibe of it matches up with old adventure serials and things like Indiana Jones. Another point in Shangri-La's favor was its new wonder weapon, the 3179 JGB215, mercifully shortened to things like the baby gun or the shrink ray. It was an area of effect weapon that shot out a blast in front of you that shrunk any zombie caught in its radius down to a mini version that could do almost no damage to you, and any damage done to it would instantly kill it, including walking right over it. It was exactly what a wonder weapon should be. It was not perfectly balanced, but it was a lot of fun to use, and it could be used to get you out of a tight corner if you got yourself stuck. There was also a really good diversity of different zombie types to keep you on your toes. This was yet another map where there weren't any dog rounds or anything like that to break up the pattern, and yet again every round was the same. But that was okay because within each round there was enough variety to keep things fresh, and there was also a different way to force max ammos. In addition to the classic zombies, the first new enemy type that spawned alongside them was the Shrieker. This was an incredibly fast zombie that tried to catch up to you, and the main threat wasn't that it did damage, but that it would try and blind you, meaning you always had to be aware of your surroundings in case you suddenly lost your vision and you had to navigate. The Shrieker's counterpart, the Napalm Zombie, was basically the exact opposite. It was slower than any other enemy type, but if it did eventually catch up to you, it would trigger a self-destruct, causing a huge explosion that could do enough damage to kill you at full health with Juggernog if you were close enough. While obviously very dangerous, a skilled player could also leverage this zombie to work for them. That explosion itself, and the patch of fire that lingered around afterwards, did massive damage to other zombies as well, so if you positioned it right, you could use it as a replacement for the missing electric traps on the map. The last enemy variant was the Monkeys, which were totally unrelated to the ones from Ascension. These ones would be sitting perched around the map just waiting for a dead zombie to drop a power-up. Once one did, they would sprint towards it and try to steal it away from the player. The kicker was that while they were holding it, the power-up would rotate between all the different options, so if you timed it right, you'd be able to turn a useless carpenter into a much-needed max ammo, or even turn that max ammo into a perk bottle. While there's no doubt that Shangri-La was a lot more difficult, it gave you all the tools you needed to succeed, and it did reward a skilled player. The Easter egg for the map, as the name of the achievement suggests, was centered around time travel. Both of the main characters back into the past, and also of the time loop that Brock and Gary were stuck in. This theme of time loops and resetting back to the beginning is the first in a series of narrative elements like this, which was later seen in maps like Mob of the Dead, and was also seen in the overarching narrative of cycles in Black Ops 3 and Black Ops 4. This motif is so prevalent because it's a meta-commentary on the actual experience itself of playing zombies. You go through a run, fighting valiantly and killing thousands of undead, but eventually you reach the end and you're forced to restart back from zero. You keep nothing from those past lives. It's a really clever and fun device that the writers kept bringing back, and it's fun to see that concept develop over time, from the first time it was acknowledged back here in Shangri-la. Overall, I do understand why a lot of people at the time were frustrated with Shangri-la. I know I personally struggled with the fact that all the skills and strategies that I had practiced and gotten good at were made irrelevant by a lot of the features of this map. And since I used the game as mostly a social experience, it was definitely frustrating having a map that was a lot less casual friendly. But playing it now, 10 years later, with all the context that brings, and looking at it as a stepping stone in the continual evolution of zombies, it's obvious how integral it was to that growth. The first half of the maps released for Black Ops 1 were still kind of figuring things out. They were still setting up the basic conventions and establishing the language of the mode. Once those foundations were well established, that's when they were able to start poking at those conventions and seeing exactly what they had, making sure they were making an experience as robust and deep as possible. Shangri-La is punishing, it's claustrophobic, and it's the opposite of a casual experience. But it's also aged incredibly well compared to the casual maps that came out before it, because of those subversions of the formula and because of its dedication to complexity and challenge.